Thank you, Ibrahim. And at the outset, let me say that it's a privilege to be here and speak in front of such an august audience. I see lots of old friends sitting in the audience, and as I said, I'm delighted and honored to be here to speak at the inauguration of what I think is a crucial juncture of our telecom sector in India. So what I'm going to do, as Ibrahim said, is set the tone for what I think lies ahead of the telecom sector and what we need to do in the telecom sector to be able to leverage all the benefits that we haven't been able to leverage or we haven't been able to really internalize. And if one estimates the kind of benefits that we haven't been able to internalize or leverage in the telecom sector, that number could be a very large number. It could run into, I dare say, it could run into billions of dollars. But that opportunity cost or opportunity loss one side, they don't want to be alarmist, because often when I recognize in the position that we are in working on economic policy, is that when you try to be alarmist, then it chills people into inaction. So rather than say that if we had done this, this would have happened, and as I said, that number is not insignificant, but to say that, well, we could have done it, but even if we do it now, there are lots of benefits to be had in the telecom sector. So my really initial remarks, these 15 minutes that I'm going to speak, will be divided into three parts. I kind of conceptually divided into three parts. One is sort of where were we and what have we done, i.e. the benefits of competition in the sector. Two is sort of what do we now need to do in terms of regulation and institutions to internalize those benefits that I'm talking about. And third is what are those huge opportunities, what is the road for the future in terms of telecom providing an input into the rest of the sectors. Most of you will recall that in 1996, when WTO first started the telecom liberalization across the world and looking at the multilateral framework, one of the key things was that it's not liberalization of the telecom sector itself that is important, but the liberalization is important because it is an enabler for other sectors. And at that moment, in 1996, I think those things were not really very clear. How that enablement or that efficiency benefits the telecom sector would be able to provide as an input to other sectors. But I think if that needed any proof, then the 21st century, or at least the last decade, has provided ample proof that telecom is not just for itself, as a sector that needs to be liberalized for itself, but it needs to be liberalized and reformed for the sake of the spillover benefits, for the efficiencies it generates for other sectors. And that's what I'm going to sort of end with, and we should continue to see telecom as an enabler of other services and other businesses. So, we've come a long way. India has come a long way, and I think we've done better than most jurisdictions around us, at least in the South Asian region, and some of the other countries as well. And, the reason we've done well, and all of you would know that since all of you have participated in that, is that we decided in the 90s that we're going to liberalize and reform the sector and invite private participation. If you wanted to remain a monopoly, then you would have been like the Indian Railways is today, which is, you license, you do policy, you do service provision, all in, the same entity. But the fact that you liberalized and reformed meant that you needed to reform the institutional structure. And I think there's a substantial amount of learning that has come in India from that reform process of telecom liberalization. And what I mean is that we know what works in India, we know the institutional framework that will work in India. We don't have to borrow and supplant things from the West, the Anglo-Saxon model, and bring them into India. We know the political economy of India works differently, and we've been through that process. And we've been able to create, I think, a fairly independent institutional framework in the telecom sector. Of course, it needs to be expanded. Of course, you need to get convergence in the institutional framework. But we've got a key ingredient, I think, in place. And that key ingredient is an independent regulator, independent from the government, independent from the telecom operators, and independent from the industry. We've created that institutional framework. Of course, in India, we know, as I study in policy and in management, that leadership matters a lot for institutions, not only in India, but everywhere else in the world. But we've created a framework that allows for competition to be able to take root. And I don't have to stand here and tell you about the benefits that competition has provided in the telecom sector in India. The benefits of competition are apparent not only in the sector, but also, in other sectors as well. And that competition from 16 rupees a minute from mobile to, less than 1 rupee a minute and no incoming has meant that it's become fairly democratic. You see everybody using mobile phones. The impacts of mobiles are enormous. People who were resistant to technology also are using technology. And mobile, you can fairly assume that for many small businesses, the mobile pays for itself. It's now become a tool of empowerment. There are a number of books written on it. And one specific book that I will recommend to all of you to look at the socio-economic impact of mobile telephony is written by an Australian sociologist called Jeffries, Robin Jeffries. He's called The Cell Phone Nation. And I think it's a fantastic reading about how, mobile phones have transformed India. There's been a lot of talk that in India, mobile phones have got there's been focus of attention of policy on mobile telephony. And not for wrong reasons, because we are going to be a mobile-first nation, whether it's voice or whether it's data. So it's not that we loved fixed network. I'm using Shakespeare a bit. It's not that we loved fixed network less, but we just loved mobile networks more. It's like we didn't, as Brutus said, it's not that I loved Caesar less, but I loved Rome more. And India is a country which has, in some sense, been mobile first, and it will continue to mobile first, not, as I said, at the expense of fixed line telephony, but for the sake of overcoming the huge number of infrastructure deficits that we have, the information deficits, the physical infrastructure deficits. The mobile phone was a boon for many Indians. And we got that right. We introduced competition. We had lots of pitfalls as, democratic countries like India, and I hate to use this word over and over again, the vested interests, but there are the political economy, but we've been able to overcome them, sometimes by talking, sometimes by diktat, sometimes by collaboration, but we've been able to overcome that. And the rest of the world knows today that the benefits of competition are apparent. So that was my, first, in a sense, point, that we have to recognize, everybody has to recognize that the benefits of competition are apparent, but concomitantly, correspondingly, you need to create an independent regulatory mechanism in place. And I think the learnings from the telecom sector can be applied to other sectors that we are going to liberalize. We've liberalized airlines, we've got an open skies policy now, and we need to then think of the institutional framework that we will have to implement and borrow from the example of telecom, where you have an independent regulator and you have a mechanism for universal service, just like you need to have a mechanism to be able to subsidize or to be able to fund airports or air traffic going into smaller feeder routes. You need to do that, and you need some sort of an USOF sort of mechanism there. And those learnings, the process of liberalization, it took us 20 years, but in other sectors, the learnings can easily be applied. And I remember that the fact that we created a TDSAT in 2000, the Telecom Dispute Settlement, that model, breaking the regulator from the administrative and quasi-judicial functions, that model was applied to various other sectors and became the template for how India was going to liberalize and invite participation. CISA cannot sit on judgment on CISA, TRI cannot sit on judgment on its own orders, was the kind of framework that that template provided, and as I said, was expanded to other sectors. So as I look at India evolving, there are huge learnings, and all of you have played a part in the process of reform in the sector. The second point that I wish to make is about how are we going to now that the fact that we are on a point of inflection, now we've reached some sort of a plateau. You've got 1.2 billion connections. The imminent data revolution is going to happen in India. Do we need reform of the institutional structure? Do we need to look at the framework afresh? And I think TRAI has given out recommendations, and most of those recommendations hopefully should be incorporated into the telecom policy. But I just want to pick out one aspect, and I'm sure this would resonate with a number of you who are in the industry, and it's something that I've written about, we've researched, which is that when liberalization happened, India was divided into 22 telecom circles, each 22, 23. Metros were separate. You had duopoly in particular circles, and then you had over time you liberalized, and then one looks back at that scenario and says, what was the logic of having these circles? Of course, one was that you had an incumbent DOT, or then later BSNL, which was corporatized in MTNL. So you had to ensure that they survived. You almost can never make liberalization or reform revenue neutral. Just like it's been very difficult to have GST, which is revenue neutral. In some sense, you tried to make it revenue neutral. Just like similarly, you want to make reform revenue neutral, but it's almost impossible to do it for a sector like telecom. So there were kind of instances where the private operators were forced to do things so that BSNL and MTNL continued to get the revenue they were getting, which is that they're forced to take calls through the incumbent networks, etc. So that was, as I said, to ensure that the incumbents didn't die or continue to do what they were doing in terms of service provision. But I don't want to focus on that. What I want to focus on was, what was the sort of objective of the state? By state, I mean, of course, the Ministry of Finance or the Government of India. And the objective of the state was that here you were inviting private participation, and therefore you needed to get revenue from them. India is a country which runs fiscal deficits, and telecom sector became a source of revenue for the state, and continues to be a source of revenue for the state, be it through spectrum, be it through sporadic disinvestments that happened in the sector. But the objective of creating these barriers was to ensure that there was continued to be revenue paid by the telecom sector into the exchequer, and that was one of the objectives of the state, and the state has exercised that objective over time, even over those 22 years since liberalization. And I think that it's time to look at that afresh, whether that's upfront levies of the magnitude that the state charges the telecom sector, and you would, I'm sure, empathize with this, whether that's a good source or whether there are other ways to generate the same resources. And I don't want to get into the details of elasticities, etc., but there are other ways in which the state can get revenues. And of course, you have the auctions in place, and therefore, if you have auctions in place, then one has to consider the objective of other sorts of levies. Other countries levy administrative charges, and if you auction spectrum, and then the sector provides taxes, GST, or whatever that the sector has to bear. So creating those barriers, artificial barriers, one of the objectives, of course, of the state was to get revenue. But I think now it's time to look at it afresh. It's time to look at those artificial distinctions or artificial barriers afresh. We have, when I first started working on the telecom sector, I was really surprised to note that a call to Nepal would cost 6 times more than a call to United States. I didn't know better, although I was an economist, but that doesn't mean you know any better. But I didn't know better. And now I know better that, look, it's supply and demand. And of course, distance has ceased to be relevant in telecommunications. And that's the beauty of mobile networks, or that's the beauty of sinking in cables and optical fiber and submarine cables across the oceans and in the land. So distance has died. And therefore, having state boundaries for the objective or the instrumentality of revenue generation for the state has to be looked at afresh, because it creates barriers. And I think that this is something that TRI has recommended, one nation, one license, etc. And I would go a step further, is that we ought to be looking at a sector in which not only there is convergence. Yesterday I was speaking at an event, also a similar sort of event on satellite communications. And I think it's also important to look at all forms, not only terrestrial cables and mobile networks, but also satellite, so that they could all be sort of integrated to provide broadband, because as Ibrahim said in the beginning, it's broadband that's going to drive India. And that's the last point that I wish to make, is as an enabler of a telecom to be seen as an enabler of other businesses. So before I get to that point, I just want to leave this thought with you, and you're all, as I said, eminent people working in the sector, is that I worked, in the middle of both private and public. I've been a regulator in the past, and I've been a neutral sort of observer of the sector. And I find that one of the things that is worrying about the sector, worrying in the sense, in terms of the relationship between the state and the private sector, and not only telecom, it's kind of a larger sort of feature of India, is this trust deficit that exists between the state and the private sector. And as I said, it's not only in telecom, but kind of if you look at the Ministry of Finance, you look at the Central Board of Direct Taxes, CBDT, there seems to be this deficit between the state and the private sector. And it's reflected in the fact that our PPPs were also something we started with a bang and we ended with a whimper in some sense, and we're trying to revive that model of engagement of private participation. But I think it may sound abstract, but I've seen it with my own eyes, as I said, as a neutral observer, that somehow if we are able to bridge this gap, or at least reduce the gap between the state and the private operators in telecom, which I think would then provide a template for other sectors to follow, it will serve the sector and the country well. And therefore, when the industry demands things, it would not be looked at negatively. And when the state demands things of the industry, it would not be looked at negatively, because we are all in it for the benefit of ultimately the consumer and benefit of the nation. So I just wanted to leave that thought with you. I don't know how it can be done. It can only be done through constant engagement and probably with the power of example. If you demonstrate that you're not always looking at individual benefits, then the state could, and similarly the state should also see the operators in a positive light. And I think that deficit should over time be bridged for the benefit of the country. The last point I wish to make is what I said right in the beginning, is telecom as an enabler. And as I said, when I started working in telecom in the early mid 90s, I could not have imagined where we are today. And today, you're talking of things which one could only dream about in not only the sector but otherwise. And to give you a very crude example is the fact that when I was working, I used to teach and spend a lot of time teaching and explaining to my students that what is the optimal amount of cash you should carry in your wallets. ATMs had just begun to come about, and there were models in economics to suggest that what is based on your expenditure pattern, the amount of cash that you could keep in your wallets, because every trip to the bank could, in terms of minutes, would cost you. There would be transactions costs for every trip that you made to the bank, and if you were in a bank, going to a bank in India, you could spend a lot time in the bank just to take out 3,000 or 4,000 rupees and decide what is the optimal amount that you needed to keep in your wallet. And there are models, as I said, that kind of describe and articulate those transactions costs. Then came along ATMs that reduced the amount that you need to carry in your wallets. Today, if you go to developed countries where the architecture of payments is evolved, you would hardly find people going to banks or to ATMs to withdraw money and carrying cash in their wallet. And that's the transition that has been enabled by telecom sector. And you can take by telecoms, by connections, by internet, and there are hordes and scores of examples that one can think of where efficiency has been enabled. You can just think of railway reservations, you can think of airline tickets, you can think of hotel reservations, you can think of retail. The biggest business today in retail does not own its own stores. The biggest fleet of cabs does not own a single car. And can you imagine this could have happened in the 90s when the mobile or telecom revolution was beginning to happen? I could not have imagined this, and I cannot imagine what would happen in the future. We are talking of artificial intelligence, we are talking about AI, we are talking about driverless cars, we are talking about already pilots. The role of pilots in planes is fairly limited, takeoff and landing, and they are on autopilot most of the time. So that's the benefit that telecom sector has been able to provide other sectors, create businesses which were not thinkable. And we know this now, and it is time for, I think, this is an opportune moment, I would say the fourth industrial revolution, or what we are talking about in India today, is that how do you enable, as Ibrahim was saying, digital India? I don't know, what the template or what the route will be, but the learnings from the past suggest to me that a hands-off policy in terms of regulation or in terms of intervention will be more beneficial than an interventionist policy. I think it is time to say that regulation by exception, if there is an abuse, I will get into the market. Otherwise, I will let the market decide what it's going to do on its own. Otherwise, if you're going to try and second guess innovation, it's going to be a mug's game. And I don't think we should get into that. And that would be my sort of, I don't know what 5G is going to enable one to do. And there are, people, I've heard people talk about the huge sort of magnitudes of different businesses that are going to emerge with 5G. But for India as an economist, and those, pardon me, and those benefits I think are going to be realized by regulating by exception and not being too prescriptive about what we are going to do in the future. By being prescriptive, we know the costs, as I said, we've had to incur, and it's best not to be prescriptive. And I'm not going to talk about what we need to do with BharatNet and broadband. You all know that, and we need to, improve the speed of deployment, etc. All of that. But the enablement of other businesses and the impact that it's going to have not only on the telecom sector but on the rest of the country, and the role that businesses can play. One of the things that worries the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Jaitley, it could be Mr. Suresh Prabhu, we are talking about e-commerce just 2 more minutes, in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, and all of that. What is worrying for India? And you heard from Mr. Prabhu as well in Buenos Aires that our sort of 600 million people in India are poor, and therefore we cannot sacrifice their interests for the interests of developed countries like the United States. And that was a clear message that Mr. Prabhu sent out in Argentina. And, India faces enormous challenges. I've talked very optimistically about the benefits of the telecom sector and how the telecom sector is providing enablement to other businesses by creating other businesses. And another role that the telecom sector could play, I think, is in trying to sort of alleviate this huge employment deficit that we see in India, or the jobless growth that India sees. And that's what bothers, I think, a lot of people in government, in policy making, is that not enough jobs have been forthcoming. And of course, no single sector can provide the solution. But I think broadband, telecommunications can provide a part of the solution, because the fourth industrial revolution is going to destroy jobs. There is no doubt about it, but it's also going to create jobs. It's going to create new business models. India is home to the third largest country for startups. I don't need to preach to the converted. So, so that's the kind of magnitude of benefits that are available in the sector. And so the sector, I think, the role that the sector can play in regard to ensuring that we are able to create jobs and therefore reduce inequality is, I think, some amount of appreciation of the fact that we will be able to create skills that are necessary for people that are going to be employed in the sector. So I think the push towards skilling the people is important, and I think the sector can play a role. And our research in ICRIER on jobs seems to always suggest, especially at the entry level, is that there is some sort of obsession in India with wanting to work for the government. But we know that the public sector is not going to create jobs. 28 applicants, 28 openings in Uttar Pradesh at class 4 level invites 120,000 applicants, some of them master's degree. I mean, it's almost bizarre, even if those were accurate reflections of their backgrounds or education qualification. It's bizarre that there is this obsession with wanting to work for the government. And the only way out of it, I think, is to be able for the private sector, like telecommunication, to demonstrate that it can also become a large employer of people at the relatively low skill, unskilled level. Because that's the problem that India faces. A labor abundant country, relatively unskilled, education levels are low, skill levels are low, and those are the people that need to be employed. And those are the sorts of people that always want to work in government. And we need to sort of change that attitude, change that behavior, because government, as you know, cannot create those jobs. The role of the government in the economy is shrinking. The role of the private sector is increasing. And that's where telecom sector, I think, the entire, telecom is just a sort of example, but it's the larger sector that I'm talking about, the converged sector, that it can demonstrate, it can create jobs for those sort of people. And if the telecom sector is able to do that, then this would be the icing on the cake. As it is doing so much in terms of benefits and spillovers for the rest of the economy. And if it's able to address this jobs challenge, even in an incremental, marginal way, I think it would be a great service to our nation. I'll stop here. My time is out. Thank you very much for listening to me. It's been a pleasure to speak.